Welcome to the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. The Invisible Wheelchair Podcast was selected by FeedSpot as one of the top 10 obsessive-compulsive disorder podcasts on the web. I'm Donald Grodoff, EFT tapping practitioner and OCD coach at FamilyOCD.com. On the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, I focus on the hidden world of OCD and anxiety with interviews and information around this topic. My purpose is to bring about awareness of OCD, those who treat OCD, and of course, those who suffer with OCD. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is a treatable and manageable disorder. In my practice at FamilyOCD.com, I guide people through the process of ERP therapy and other alternative treatments. If you know of someone suffering with OCD, I can help. Simply visit FamilyOCD.com. If you or someone you know suffers or has suffered and recovered from OCD and would like to get their story out, simply contact us through www.invisiblewheelchair.com. We want to talk to you and get your story out on the podcast. Know that the ideas and thoughts presented here are not necessarily those of Family OCD, Invisible Wheelchair Podcast, or Donald Grodoff. We also ask you to take just a few moments and leave comments at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. Those comments help us to know what the next topic should be, and we really want to hear from you. Now, let's get to that podcast. Amy Lang has her master's in applied behavioral science and has been a sexual health educator for over 25 years. With her lively, engaging, and down-to-earth style, she helps parents become their kids' go-to birds and bees source. Amy's books, online solution center, and podcast show parents that talking about sexuality doesn't need to be totally uncomfortable and really can be fun. She also works with early childhood educators, providing childhood sexuality and sexual abuse prevention training. Amy is still married to her first husband, and they are getting the hang of parenting their recently launched man-child. She lives in Seattle, Washington, and you can learn more about Amy and her work at birdsandbeesandkids.com. Now, let's join that interview. So Amy, thank you so much for being part of the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
I'm really excited to be here. When we chatted the other day, I was like, yes, I am super excited to talk to you. So I'm all good all around.
Good. So what I always do at the beginning is I ask my guests to, if they can, give a little story about themselves that kind of help my audience get the personal feel about them. Are you able to do that for us today?
Yes, I definitely am. People are always really curious about how I started doing this work because I don't have a typical job. And so I was a sexual health educator all through my 20s and into my 30s. I was doing birth control, pregnancy counseling, STI counseling, had talked to all different kinds of people, totally loved it. It was my hobby. I had assumed that when I had kids that I would just be a rock star at the sex talks. When my son, Milo, who's 19 now, was about 4 or 5, he was getting ready for a bath and he grabbed his penis and he said, "Hey, Mama, did you know?" And I stood there and I looked at him and I thought, oh God, please don't tell me it feels good to touch your penis because I've got nothing. So I'm standing there and I did that, that parenting thing where you have like a poker face. I'm like super calm. And I said, "What?" And he said, "I can see the veins in there where the blood goes." And I said, "Great, get in the bathtub." And, that was the moment where I was like, excellent. Like, I am totally unprepared for this. I know that's true. I know about penises. Like, I've been around one or two in my life. And so I was like, oh God, you've got to figure this out. So I started doing some research and just trying to figure out, like, when should we start the conversations with kids? And is it okay? Like, what do I tell a 5-year-old? Like, how do we do this? And while I was doing that research, I learned a ton. And I also have a master's degree, and my focus was in adult education. So I just combined my two favorite things, teaching adults and talking about sex. And so here we are 15 years later.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Amy. That's a wonderful story, and I kind of can relate to it because I know those feelings of, when they hit you with those odd questions like, this feels good, Daddy. What is this? Or when you're on the diaper changing table and the little fountain comes across, and stuff like that. So,
Yes.
and that's what, Amy, that's what I really admired about when I heard your podcast, and you and I talked even, that you're just boldly going out there and talking about something that a lot of people think almost like it's voodoo, that it's I know, especially myself growing up, it was a subject that wasn't, touched upon. How do you see yourself being received by this? Did you say you've been doing this for 15 years now?
Mhm. At the beginning, I was completely on my own. Like, I think I tried to find folks who were doing what I was doing, and I think I found maybe two or three. So I was really kind of an outlier doing parent education around sexuality. As I started to increase my reach with folks and teach more, and I live in the Seattle area, I started to see more people and get to more parents. Initially it was really pretty like, oh, what do you do? And my dad was a biologist, and he loved our botanist. And he loved to tell people what I do because he loved to see the shock, right? He'd say he teaches parents how to talk to kids about sex. I learned pretty early on that I couldn't say that to people because they would recoil from me. So I
Yeah.
started saying, I help parents talk with their kids about the birds and the bees. And then people could lean in, right? Because if you
Mhm.
say the word sex, even today when things are better in that department, people kind of like all that anxiety and they get flooded and they don't know what to do with me. So, I would say, my style, I'm super direct. I tend to swear. I dumb things down because that's one of my superpowers is making this more simple, helping parents feel honestly just to kind of get over themselves and see that like how they get in the way of the conversations, and then just talking about their kids in terms of like kids are totally open, and I focus on kids ages 2 to 12, and I don't work with children, just their parents. So over the years, if my field is and people are doing what I'm doing, one of my colleagues says I'm OG, and I'm the OG, and I'm like, oh my god, don't say that, it makes me feel old. She said that, and so now there's more folks doing what I'm doing, and we come at it from different angles, just in terms of being sexuality educators working with parents and families. It's becoming more and more accepted because people are seeing, especially through social media and porn exposure and all of that, the real need for families and for parents in particular and caregivers to start having these conversations. So yeah, I mean, I'm not for everyone. I'm liberal, I'm white, I'm cisgender, I'm married to a man. I'm not for everyone. I'm progressive, and I'm open, and I'm an atheist. So I know I'm not for everyone. I do believe that everyone wants their child to grow up to be a whole, healthy, happy adult. And so that's my whole motivation. Like, I love kids and I like working with adults, but for me, it's really about kids. It's not about grown-ups. That makes
Okay.
sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. How do you see it has changed? I mean, I was a child of I'm born in late 50s and 60s as far as kind of my growing up years. I'm sure you've seen it change. How have you seen it change over that time?
Well, I mean, I was born in 1967, so I'm a little younger than you, but we all mostly got kind of the same thing, which was don't do it. Good luck with that. Some folks, like I had really pretty good sexuality education in school. And because of where I grew up, and, it was the late 70s, early 80s. And so there was some pretty good push there around, depending on where you lived. But what I'm seeing now is that, when AIDS was, in the late 80s, early 90s, when AIDS was huge, sexuality education got really good and it was really increased and more, in schools in particular. So people were being better about it. And then things have changed. And so it's not as good. So the pendulum, it swings, right? What's happening now is it appears to be parents are talking more with their kids, which is good. And parents of all beliefs, because they know what it was like to not have enough information, and for me, that was a hugely motivating factor just as a parent. Like I did not get what I needed and I made decisions that I didn't want Milo to make. And I think that what we're seeing now is much more openness. And part of the problem now is the internet and porn exposure. And teenagers get the majority of their sexuality education from their peers and from porn. They say that. Their peers are getting it from porn. So they're making up like what healthy sexuality looks like. And I know some of you are like maybe thinking, dear Lord, like, like this is crazy to hear. But we have to, just accept the fact that the kind of information they're getting about relationships and sexuality is not healthy. It's not inclusive. It's still very heteronormative, one person, rest of your life, like all of that's still out there. And that's just not the reality of the world. The folks who do what I do, a lot of them are much more progressive than I am, which is good. Like we need all these different voices. And, I think at the end of the day, it's better. It's way better than when you were a kid. It's way better than when I was a kid. But then it's also worse because of the problems with the pornography access and that kind of thing.
One thing, and we really didn't talk about this, but I was wondering if you had any experience with like special needs kids with that high anxiety or like we deal with OCD, and that's what the podcast is about, ADHD. Is there do you deal with that, and is there something different that you talk to them about or have their parents talk to them about than you would with just say atypical, I guess we could call it?
Yeah, well, my belief is that we're all kind of starting from the same point, just personally, no matter who our kids are. And that the first thing we need to do is to put our big kid underpants on and suck it up, really embrace this idea that we should be and are our kids' best sexuality educators, because it's not just sex, right? It's relationships, it's values, it's a whole bunch of different stuff. For every parent, we need to figure out like, what do we believe about sexuality? What are our hopes for our kids in general? And then, you have your individual kid. We'll talk about those, your sort of special kids. I don't know what to say, kids, and just, which is true, right? In a minute. So, a whole lot of the work of having talk conversations with kids about sex is taking care of our own stuff and finding a way to kind of grapple with our past, realize that this is a fundamentally important part of life. Most parents don't want their kids learning on the job, right?
Yeah.
It's not the best. Could be worse, but it's not the best. They don't want that for their kids. So thinking about like, what do you want for your child? Lots and lots of folks were sexually abused. So how are you going to take care of that part of you? Because it can really get in the way of having the conversations for a multitude of reasons. So really, it's about us getting our poop in a group, figuring out how we're going to do this, and accepting the fact that we are really the best people to do this for our kids. There's tons of resources. I'm not the only one. Lots of places to learn how to do this and to help you like unlearn the discomfort around it. Because once you get rolling and you see that nobody dies or throws up, then it makes it a lot easier to keep the conversations going. For kids who are like the kids you described, who are anxious, OCD, ADHD, just developmentally different in some way, those kids have, parents need to do this a little bit differently. Every child is different. So I can kind of speak in broad strokes. But one of the most important things is, as parents, we all know that our kids ping off us. So if you have an anxious child and you come into this conversation with your anxious child and you're like sweaty upper lip, tweaky, like, you're not going to like this, I'm feeling really weird. Hey, did you know that a baby's made by the penis going in the vagina? Right. Your kid's going to be like, you're a freak show. Now I'm freaking out, because they're going to be more sensitive, most likely to you. So that's why I'm talking about like, you got to take care of yourself and calm down before you engage in these conversations. Most kids really appreciate just having short and sweet conversations, not like sitting down, here we go, or an uncomfortable conversation in the car, or like, okay, you're old enough now to know, and lay it all out. Like that doesn't really work for anyone. It's hard on us, it's hard on your kid. So thinking about this in terms of like sound bites, one thing I highly recommend, especially with kids who are anxious, is to say, hey, you're old enough now. We need to start talking about this. This is actually a really cool and interesting part of life. And I might feel uncomfortable, you might feel uncomfortable, but we'll live. And just like lay it out. Like this was going to be weird, maybe not, but I am aware of this, and then talk and then start the conversation. I think that one of the things for kids who are different in some way is that they are also at higher risk for sexual abuse because of the nature of who they are. Oftentimes the environments they're in, especially with more developmentally delayed kiddos. So this is another reason it's really important to talk to them openly, because it's actually protective. So if you're talking openly about bodies and body parts and consent, then your child's going to be way more likely to tell you if something happens with somebody else. If someone touches them inappropriately, shows them porn, talks to them in a way that feels weird or uncomfortable. When we're showing that we're open and calm, even though we're maybe faking it, your kids are going to be more likely to come to you. So, and that's true for every child. It's just that kids who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, kids of color, they are at higher risk for sexual abuse. Kids who are anyway developmentally delayed, they're at higher risk. And so just being like kind of aware of that, especially, in terms of who y'all are interacting, and families and different, we have all kinds of different families and that kind of thing.
You've touched on it. Is there anything special about the language used in it? Now I know in your podcast, your language is all over the place.
Yes, very salty.
But I mean, yes, but that's okay. That like I said, that's the bold side that I think it's kind of a shock factor that kind of breaks the ice. Excuse me, breaks the ice in some way in a little bit. It kind of makes a person coming on go either they want to keep going on it or they're off. There's no iffy. Maybe this is anyway. But when you're talking to the parents, are you telling them about some certain way or language to use in doing this?
Yeah, for sure. So I am a super fan of using the simplest words possible when we're talking with kids. So as an example, I highly recommend that everyone quit using the word inappropriate, because it does not mean anything. Like at the end of the day, inappropriate means not okay, right? It's not okay. It's not safe. So that's one of my big and one of Amy's triggers is like, just quit saying inappropriate to kids, because they don't hear it. It's just blah, blah to them. They don't understand it. So that's the first thing. Like, don't be afraid to use really simple terms. Kids need to know the correct names for everybody's private body parts, not just their own, because they just have a right to know that. It's not going to harm them, scare them, anything to say, that's a penis, that's a vulva. It's actually protective, because if somebody messes with a person with a vulva and she says, hey, somebody touched my vulva, as opposed to, hey, somebody touched my cookie or my taco, that's not clear, right? If you haven't been using the correct names in your family, depending on how old your kids are, if they're like 3 and under, just switch it up. And if they are 4 or 5, just say, you're old enough now to know that that's actually called your penis, and lay it out. And this is one of the reasons we have books, and I've got lots of books on my website that I recommend. So being really simple, really clear. A formula I like to use is facts plus values plus limits. So when you're talking to a kid, you can say, let me think of something. Let's talk about tampons. A little weird. Everybody needs to know what they are, right? So what's a tampon? When a person has a period, and a period is, the kid needs to know what a period is, and the blood comes out of their vagina, they can use a tampon, which is like a cotton plug that they can put inside their vagina, right? That's what it is. Value about tampons? Hallelujah. That's my value, right? Change the world, right? So that's my value about tampons. They're a really great thing. And then the limits would be, for me, you need to wait until, girls waited, a little while she's had her period before she uses them. when you use them, they can't stay in forever. So some talking about like the hygiene of them, and they're not for everyone, right? Just to make that really clear. So pretty much every like topic, we can use that facts, values, and limits thing. So we could talk about the first time someone has sex. Well, what does that mean? Well, usually it means people have penis and vagina sex. And the first time they do that, sometimes that's called losing your virginity. Now we say first time sex. My values about it are it's really important to wait until you're in a loving, committed relationship. You're able to talk about blah, 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 right? All the things. And then limits for me, it's like, you really need to know that you're ready. And this is how you'll know, right? So kind of spelling that out. For lots of families, they want their kids to wait until they get married before they have that, any kind of sex. And that's just, sorry, like I said, it's unreasonable.
No,
It's not,
I
it
understand
doesn't
that.
happen. When you have that belief, which I'm totally down with, you also need to say, in our family, we believe, but if you change your mind about that's our hope for you, but if you decide to be sexual with someone, of course you can tell us. We might not be happy, but we'll make sure you're ready and safe and okay. And so, our kids are never going to do what we want them to do entirely, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Right? We can't control them, but we can give them enough information and talk with them in a way that they're going to do better than we did. And they're also going to see us like as, if we do the talking, they're going to see us as the source, right? Like waiting around for your kid to ask you how babies are made. If it was my child, he would wait until, I don't know, 40 to ask me. Like, it's just, again, like this is our job. It's not your kid's job to ask you questions. It's not your kid's job to say, like it's not their job to figure this part of life out. It's our job to talk to them about it so they can do that in a healthy way.
That's great. So, and here in the podcast, we're dealing with anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
and you talk about. I love the fact you brought up the idea of the parents with their baggage. Because that's where I work with parents too, and helping them first get past their baggage. But because they'll come to me going, "You need to fix him or her," and I'm like, "Well, okay, all right." But what it a lot of times comes down to is the baggage the parent has to deal with first. So what kind of advice do you give them as far as how they can handle their own anxiety about it?
Well, I think knowledge is empowering. So, reading books for kids about sexuality and kind of like if you did not grow up with good sexual health education, then there's a whole lot of stuff, whole lot of blanks. One of the best books, a book that I totally love, is called It's Perfectly Normal. And it is the book that I recommend people have starting in middle school or right before middle school. It covers everything. It's sex positive, which means that it presents sex and sexuality and relationships as a positive part of life. And that's all that means. I mean, I think people sometimes think that sex positive means like, okay, let's talk to our children about bondage and S&M. That's not the case, right? It just means that sexuality is a positive, wonderful part of life, which should be our stepping off point, right? But
Yeah.
most of us did not get that. We got the shameful, embarrassing secret. That's a lot of folks experience with that. So empowering yourself with knowledge about the nuts and bolts, that's kind of how I think about it, the basic stuff, that will help reduce your anxiety. Talking with a friend or your partner, whoever you're parenting with, about like, how do you want to do this? What's important to you? I think one thing that I found really helpful just when I was starting for myself was to think about like, what do I want for Milo ultimately? Like, what do Carrie and I see for him in terms of the first time he has sex or is in a relationship, has his first girlfriend or boyfriend, like that. Like we really talked about that and I really thought about it. And so that gave me goals. And then the other thing too is that we really just have to come to terms with the fact that this is just about the most important thing we do as human beings.
Yeah.
Right? We're in relationships, romantic relationships. We have sex. Like it is, and we're sexual. That is part of being human. And there's the social, the emotional, the physical, it's all the intellectual, it's all in one package right here when we talk about sexuality. If we could put it on the same level as we do freaking intellect, right? Like, I'm sorry, me knowing calculus, which I don't, me knowing calculus has done nothing for my life. Nothing. I got as far as algebra 2. Like that geometry class I took, I don't use it.
Yeah.
I don't use it. And so, yeah, okay, maybe I got an A in it, but it has done literally nothing for me as a human being. So I'm not discounting the importance of education, but what I am discounting is the ignoring of the importance of relationship and sexuality. It's like getting us nowhere, right? I mean, people don't stay in long-term relationships. There's a whole lot of reasons for that. A whole lot of that is because we don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
winging it. But just like we do our parenting, right? We wing our parenting, we wing our relationships. And then, I love that the work that you do, because you are like, hey, we need to, like, I want to help the family, right? And it's really, like you said, fix the kid. It's like, sure.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, making therapy more of an option and destigmatizing that, I think, is really, really important, because nobody wants their kid to have a crappy relationship. Nobody.
Well, your idea with the idea of the calculus and not really needing it, and really needing to talk about, like you say, the sexuality and all that, kind of goes along with the same principles of we need to teach more about socialization. We need to teach more about how to get along with each other, civility, all of that we're ignoring. So it goes along with that whole side of it that we're missing. So yeah, that's neat. That's a very good thing to point out there. I wanted to kind of wrap it up here, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to let people know what's the best way to get a hold of you to find out more about what you do.
So my website, birdsandbeesandkids.com, has a ton of resources and information. There's a bookstore. I've written a couple of books. My book, Birds and Bees and Your Kids, was really intended to help folks do exactly what you asked me about. Like, how do I basically take care of myself so that I can have these conversations? I'd say that for people who are feeling pretty anxious about this, that would be a really good place to start, because we want to get grounded. So that's another really good resource. And then what else is on my site? I have a solution center, which is a standalone library where people can pop in and get videos and information for themselves and their kids. And then if you're a podcast listener, if you're listening to this podcast and I didn't completely offend you, you can go and potentially get completely offended by me. I'm not. And my podcast is called Just Say This, and it's Q&A style. So people call in, ask me questions, and I answer them on the air. It is a potluck. It is potluck. Like, there aren't really any themes. Like, somebody will call and ask about their 5-year-old rubbing themselves constantly. And somebody else will ask about, somebody just asked me about, how do I wash my sex toys? My kid's always around. I know. I was like, excellent question. Let me think about that for a minute. Anyway.
Does that go in the dishwasher?
Right. This is a very funny question. So if you're a podcast listener, and I get that I am not for everyone, but there is something for everyone, especially parents of kids between ages 2 and 12 on my website for sure. So yeah. And can I just say one more thing? Okay, so this is a topic that makes parents really anxious. I just want to give you a tiny bit of advice. So first of all, take a deep breath. And there was probably something we talked about today that made you perk up. And so I just would highly recommend that you pick one little thing to do to just help yourself get started. So maybe it's sharing this podcast with whoever you're parenting with. Maybe it's looking at books on my website. Maybe it's reading a blog post. Just pick one little thing, and then you'll feel better. And then pick another thing, and then the snowball should happen. And don't be afraid of this. Don't be afraid of this. It can be really fun and funny. I mean, my first story, right? Hilarious. Anyway, it can be really fun and funny, and it doesn't need to be this big ball of anxiety.
That's great. That is really great. Well, Amy, I so much appreciate and enjoyed this conversation, and I think it's going to be extremely helpful for my audience and throughout the world, really. So thank you so much for being part of this again today.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for trusting me with your people.
This concludes this podcast. We really would appreciate your comments. Simply leave a comment at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. There, you're able to submit a comment that will help us determine future podcasts. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, please email don@invisiblewheelchair.com. Remember, there is a corresponding tapping recording for each of the podcasts, with the exception of the interview podcast. You can find these tapping recordings and archive past podcasts at www.invisiblewheelchair.com. Finally, there is relief for OCD, and we at FamilyOCD.com and FocusedHealthyFamily.com can help you find that relief. Again, you can contact us through those sites, FamilyOCD.com or FocusedHealthyFamily.com. You can also find us on Facebook at Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at InvisibleWheel1, that's the number 1, or at FamilyOCD. So thank you for listening. Keep tapping and transcending your life to new heights.